Now let's try to summarize what we've learned in this section of the course. First of all, we looked at how a dependency injection container is actually used. It's basically a two-step construction process. So first of all, we used a container builder to actually register the components that we want to use as part of our system. Now remember, if your system uses a component, this component absolutely must be registered in the container builder. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to use it and you'll simply get an exception. And then once you've built the container using container builder.build, you can use the container to resolve any particular component that you need. Of course, we're talking about components which have been registered. You cannot resolve something that hasn't been registered in the container builder. Now, when it comes to registering types, there are lots and lots of ways of actually doing it. But some of the most common ones are something like builder.registerType. This basically registers a component of type foo so that whenever anybody asks the container to resolve the type foo, this operation would actually succeed. You also have this more evolved, shall we say, definition where you register a component of type foo to provide a particular service. In this case, I'm saying register type foo as ifoo, which means that when you resolve for an ifoo, you get an instance of foo. However, please note that in this case, if you try to resolve for a foo, you will fail because the type itself hasn't been registered as a component. You're only registering it for a particular service. If you want to register it for both, you can use the as self extension to do that as well. And in this case, it will be available both as foo and as ifoo as well. Now, by default, the last registration for a particular service is the one that's actually being used, which means that if you take the builder and you register type foo to provide ifoo, and then you register bar as an ifoo, then resolving on ifoo will keep giving you bar. It will never give you foo because the last registration is the one that's actually default, and you can actually prevent registrations from changing the default by putting the preserve existing defaults at the end of your registration statement. Now, the constructor with the most arguments is typically chosen by default to be used in the injection. Now, this certainly varies. For example, if you have a constructor which takes a few primitive types, then it might not necessarily be used. So the algorithm is fairly sophisticated in terms of choosing the constructor to go for, but you can always override this mechanism. So you can specify your own constructor to be used, and this is done using the using constructor function. So here we say builder register type foo, but then we say please use a constructor which takes two arguments, where the first argument is of type bar and the second argument is of type baz. You simply provide them comma separated inside round brackets. So this is a hint which constructor to actually use. Now, in addition to using types and registering types like this, you can also register existing instances of types, which is particularly useful for testing. So in this case, you can simply pre-manufacture a particular type, and then you can say builder.register instance as a particular service. And in this case, whenever somebody asks for the service ifoo, they will be given the instance of foo that you've actually specified. Now, we also looked at Lambda expression components, and these are the most flexible ways of calling constructors and doing other things because they let you specify exactly which constructor to call and with what argument. So here you also use the register function, but you use it with a lambda, and this lambda allows you to resolve certain things because the type of the lambda is iComponent context, and this is precisely the type you should be using to resolve any dependencies in your type. So if you want your container to resolve the engine type by initializing it with the resolved ilog service as well as the ID of 123, this is how you define it. And please note that you should not be trying to do the resolve using the container itself. I know it's very tempting to take the container and say in the closure container.resolve ilog, but this is not the correct way. You should definitely be using the iComponent context. Now, in addition, the last thing that we mentioned is open generic components that let you serve a particular service, a generic service with a type X for every request of any particular concrete type X or foo of X as the case may be. So for example, we can register a type of list to fulfill requests for the iList service, and then whenever anybody asks, for example, for an iList event, they're going to get a list event.